Now that we have basic stuff set up, we can start creating our code for our first Lambda function, which is the create URL. This will interact with DynamoDB, where we can store the JSON for the URL. So we're going to clean this up a bit. In fact, we can go ahead and delete most of this out. And let's go ahead and import a few things that we'll probably need. So we're going to need OS, and these things, we don't necessarily need to add anything in the requirements. For these are default libraries that Lambda function or Python supports already. And we also need Boto3. And this is the library that allows us to interact with the AWS resources. And let's set up a few things with our OS. If we open up our template, right, there's some environment variables. If we go back to our Lambda function, and this is the table name and the ARN. We'll probably only need a table name. So let's grab this environment variable name, and I'll show you how to just get that value from using OS library. So let's say table name equal os.environ, and let's pass in the value, and we need a DynamoDB resource. So DynamoDB equal .resource, and this value could be anything. This is just to make it simple. And let's tell Boto library which resource we need. We need a DynamoDB table. So we have those things out the way. We have a resource, we have a table name, and we also need a DynamoDB table. So let's do table equal the resource that we created dot table, and let's pass in table name. So those are probably some of the basic stuff we'll access later on, and we can probably start writing out our Lambda function now. So one thing I like to do is to print the event. Later on we can probably change this to use or the default logger. So we're going to print the event, and event is pretty much the request in its entirety. There's a lot of information in the event, and there's some additional stuff we want to grab later on. So let's print this so we can take a look at it in our logs later on. And we also need to grab the body of the actual request, and this would include the URL or any request we're sending within the API request. So let's do a JSON.loads, and it will be event within the, and this is just a syntax we use to grab values from JSON objects in Python. Also, let's print this, and this is just a way just to keep track. Let's use a if string. Let's say body from event, and let's call that body. And we want the original URL. Is in our API request, right? We're going to create a shortened version of a URL. So we want to store the original one so we can map those later on. So let's just call this original URL, and that will be within the body again. .get, and we'll just call this the same key. And later on when we try to test this, if you haven't written any API before with Lambda function, it's very simple, just writing regular Python code, but there's just some nuances that we'll probably take a look at. And then the other thing we need is the actual short URL response. Now this is something that we will be generating, and it should be unique. Every time we create a short URL, it should be unique and mapped to a original URL. So I'm just gonna say generate, and this will be a function that we haven't created yet. So let's call it generate short code. Let me just grab this, and let's just say define, and it should take a URL. And this is the pass for now. We'll write this out later on, but this should take the original URL, create a short version, and return the short version so we can save it. So we'll come back to this later on. This should be enough to get started. We do need to generate the short code URL. So there's a few ways we can do this. We can actually use a GUID to generate a unique key. One thing with GUID by default, though, it does generate maybe the characters are very long. So we may need to trim them down a bit, up to maybe 5 or 6 characters, just to make it a little more unique. But let's actually go ahead and create that function. So let's import UUID, and let's see how we can actually go ahead and create this. So one thing we need, so before we write the code for generate shortcode, let's talk about this function first, right? So there is a number of ways to do this. And I've tried a few examples. I'm going to show you one of the simplest way, and I'll leave it up to you to research one that works. Now the goal here is to always have a unique string, but at the same time we want to limit the number of characters so we can keep our tiny URL tiny, right? So if we use UUID, which is pretty much the best way to do it, we'll always get a unique code, but the string or number of characters can sometimes be a bit long. And so we could split that maybe in half, maybe always say limit to 4 or 5 characters, but then you're still risking a unique string appearing. So there's a few ways to do this. I'll start off with a simple way, and probably we can explore other options. One is we can really check if the URL or the code is unique in our database before we save it, maybe not in a loop, but in a specific 1 or 2 times, and generate a new one. We probably don't want that to keep running, so we have to limit that. So that gets a little complex. So let's just keep it simple for now, and later on we can explore some additional option. So in this way, I'm going to keep the URL since we'll send a request, but I'll also put a length here, make this static for now. So let's say we want to keep all short codes to 6 characters. I'm going to use the random, instead of UUID, we'll explore this later. I'm going to use the random library. So let's import random, and let's just create a car pool. And this here we can say we want a combination of string, maybe uppercase, lowercase, and maybe some digits. So let's do a string.ascii. And we're gonna append this. Actually, yeah, we do need to import string as well. So here we're getting a little bit expanding our list of libraries. So let's do string.ascii plus, and this should be ASCII letters, right? We want to append that to string.digits. Actually, we could also append, so let's a string.ascii uppercase. So here we have a few flexibility, right? We're chaining together a list of options to make our character pool as unique as possible. And let's just return this. And let's use a join function. And we're going to call the random function here that sample. And the sample should be from our character pool. And let's also tell the random function how long the string should be. So we'll pass in the length, which is 6. And we don't need this anymore. So this should give us a unique character of 6 with a combination of uppercase, lowercase. However, there may be times where this could generate something twice. So we need to account for this later on. So later on, input checks So make sure the string isn't already in database. And that could be your own project as well. Maybe that's you can actually come up with a better way of doing this. So here we have our unique. We're gonna pass in the original URL, and so we'll always get back a short response here. So this create function, it should be pretty straightforward. Another thing we want to display is whenever a user sends a request to create a short URL, in the actual response, right, even if this is an API or from maybe you're building a website for this, you may want to display the actual short URL, what that will look like, because that's what you'll probably be sharing so people could access your website with. So we'll actually create the short code URL itself dynamically, and we can back in a response. So let's do short URL, and we're going to use a f string to compile this. So let's say HTTPS, and I'll explain this later on. So inside our event, remember I said the event really brings back a lot of information. There's some additional data we can grab, and one of that is the actual header and the host, as in the actual domain. And later on, when we use our own custom domain, this code should work as well. So let's go ahead and grab from the event. We want the headers, and right under your header, we should get the host, and this is the actual domain. API Gateway does create a domain. It's very long, so we probably don't want to use it for testing. So we want to get that, and it should be your domain, which would be, let's say, www.shortcode/ the actual shortcode or short or response. And this will generate the endpoint or URL that we need to access. And let's just create a data JSON. And this will pretty much be the JSON that gets stored in DynamoDB. So what we need is an ID. DynamoDB, unlike other databases, doesn't create a unique key when you create data, so you want to do that yourself. So we're going to use a string UUID, which should give us a unique code, and that's a function. So that's our ID. We also want to store the original URL, and we already have that from our body, the actual short code. And this is the unique string that gets generated here. And create that. Of course, feel free to add any additional data you want to track. Here's just a few that I'll add. We can probably just use date and time, UTC. Let's actually import date time. Store this in ISO format. And sometime when you import the date and time library, you do need to specify additional stuff. So let's do from date and time, import date time and time delta if we need this later on. And we should see these now look a lot prettier.